Welcome everybody to this week's Maternity and Midwifery Hour. This is the third episode of the sixth series, and my name's Sue Macdonald, and I'm the happy curator of the Maternity and Midwifery Festivals and the Maternity and Midwifery Hours. And tonight I'm joined by two wonderful researchers and midwives. They're double thinged, skilled fantastically, which is Dr. Claire Feeley and Anna Madeley, who you can see on your screens. And we're going to be looking at personalised care, obviously with insights from research, because I have two wonderful researchers. So as we always do with our speakers, I'm going to put them both on the spot and ask them for their moment of the week. And I'm going to start with Anna for her moment of the week.
Okay, so my moment of the week was this morning, and I was picking my shopping up and I turned around to open the boot of my car and I felt the sun on my back, and it was glorious. It was only for a few minutes, but that's enough. That picked my morale up.
Yeah, so spring is coming.
It is, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. How about Claire? What's your moment of the week?
Well, it's very exciting because for the first time in my adult life, I've now got a dishwasher. So I'm sure everyone who's watching is going to be very excited for me as I slave away washing up every day. And because I cook generally properly, how I manage to use every pan, nearly every night, is beyond me. So yes, that is my moment of the week, and it probably be my moment of the month, if I'm honest.
Wow. Well, congratulations. Congratulations. I hope you're going to have a wonderful time with your dishwasher and it won't lose its sort of glow. Fantastic. So we have a warm glow with Anna, and then we have a warm glow with Claire. So thank you so much for sharing those moments. We will return to Claire and Anna, but I'm just going to do the usual little introduction and just remind you where we've come from. The Maternity and Midwifery Hour was born in the pandemic, right at the beginning, as a way of making sure we could make sure that our midwives and our student midwives, aspiring midwives, mums, dads, and paediatricians and even obstetricians could actually have a way of connecting and get good information in a sort of digestible way, because when people are so busy, having huge study days or conferences becomes more difficult. So getting an hour where you can just look at a topic and really think about it has been very useful. And of course, because I have to mention COVID, I have to give a usual tribute to our friends and colleagues who were all working at full tilt in the NHS, coping with people being off sick, coping with covering other people's work, making sure that the care that mothers and babies, and I'm looking specifically at the maternity services, the care to mothers and babies and families is carrying on its usual high quality and with its love as usual. And I hope we're going to get little snippets of that in this session this evening. So a big thank you to everyone who's working so hard. It's difficult. And we don't take it for granted. We don't take any of you for granted. It's really hard. And I'll say now, look after yourselves as well as you look after everybody else. Now, I usually do a little bit of news, and I'm not going to go political at all. I'm going to talk about dry January nearly being over. If you've managed to do dry January, well done. If you haven't, and you've done a semi-dry, well done too. Actually, there's a really good piece on the Maternity and Midwifery Forum on preventing alcohol harm in 2022. So it's more serious about the advice and support we give mums who might not know about drinking alcohol when they're pregnant. So it's a really good blog to have a look at. And I'm going to say also, I'm not, a little champagne break to Professor Leslie Page, who had a birthday last week. So we'll do a belated birthday greetings to Leslie. Hope you had a marvellous time with a little bit of bubbles on there. There's been quite a bit of news focusing on the need of pregnant and childbearing women to have their COVID vaccinations and be encouraged to take this up. And I think what it links with really is some of the discussion in the press about some health professionals being uncomfortable with having vaccinations themselves. So I'm just highlighting that on our resources sheet this week, we've put the NHS England NHS Improvement Staff Vaccination Daily Q&A drop-in series. It's only an hour, it's a virtual session. And if you're querying yourself about whether to have the vaccine and you're not sure about what you should be advising women, you should be sure about what we're advising women, because that's a very strong evidence base. But for your own selves, have a look at this, maybe ask some questions and think about it if you haven't had your vaccine as yet, because it's an important area to be clear on, I think. Okay, and today it's National Australia Day. So greetings to our Australian audience, because I know we have a lot of midwives in Australia who join us. Tomorrow is Holocaust Memorial Day, which is a sadder day, but it's important to remember that's a day to think about. And it's still Get a Balanced Life Month, still, until over the weekend. So maybe look at where you're balanced, making sure you get enough time for you as well as your work. And I wanted to mention tweeting. Now, any of you who watch this regularly will know I'm a tweeter and I love tweeting. And so I've got tweets of the day, or tweets of the week today. And one was from the lovely Shelley Higgins, who shared a lovely infographic from Powys Maternity Services. Fantastic statistics, 15% home birth rate. But what blew me away was actually the way it was put out on the tweet with all these lovely infographics. Very good to read and absorb. It's the sort of thing when you're just floating through, you don't necessarily want to read a lot of statistics, but seeing them all pictorially is fantastic. So it's really good. So thank you, Shelley, for that. And the other tweet that really I found it was a whole series of tweets, was from the lovely bootstrap cook, Jack Monroe, who many of you will have seen on the TV or on the radio, of raising the issue about food poverty and how the prices have gone up so much. And the people who are really experiencing the most hard, as always, are the poorer people who haven't got much money when the prices go up. And I think it's an example of what you can do if you really have determination, because she's been on all sorts of programs, and you'll probably have seen her. And this has led to the Office for National Statistics to change the way they calculate food price and how they watch it going up and down inflation. So that just shows what women can do and what we can all do. So well done to Jack Monroe. So now I'm going to move to the meat of the session, and I'm really excited this evening to be hearing a little bit more about personalised care. We use the word personalised and individualised a lot. And I think what's going to be interesting this evening is I think this might challenge the things that we take for granted. And I love that, because it makes you think slightly differently. So we're going to welcome very much Dr. Claire Feeley, who will be known to many of you. She's a midwife, she's a researcher, she's an advocate, an educator, and she's a lecturer at King's College, London. She qualified as a midwife in 2011, achieved an MSc in 2015, a PhD in 2019. Just shows how talented this woman is. She's worked clinically in all areas of midwifery, in all settings and across different trusts. She's specialised in normal birth across the risk spectrum, water immersion, advocacy and change implementation. Whew. Her primary research focus has been on the socio-cultural political interactions upon women's access to, engagement with and experience of maternity care. So this is grounded with interests of health inequalities, childbirth choices, autonomy, rights and care, provision issues, and her core research focus is on full scope midwifery skill, competence and enabling, or not, work environments and the solution to overcoming many of the issues. So welcome to Claire. The screen is now yours, Claire, and thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you for that epic introduction. Boy, oh boy, that bio's wording now, isn't it? I might have to cut back. But the final bit is a perfect segue into this talk, because most of you, I would say there's quite a few of you out there who know me very well, going on about my PhD all the blinking time. And the bit that I presented on the most is how midwives have facilitated out of guidelines normal physiological birth choices. And that was a huge wide range spectrum, from a little nudge out of guidelines to a giant leap where women have had multiple complexities, etc. And that knowledge is really important because it's been generated from the ground up, it's from the midwives, and this is how we can learn how the rest of us can deliver safe and personalised care. And particularly, and most importantly, this personalised care is absolutely aligned with the human rights framework. And we know personalised care is now a key policy driver. And although it's been part of everything since changing childbirth, personalised care is the buzzword, and it is being implemented across the country. So this research really helps capture and helps push forward that drive to personalised care when we understand how midwives can support those with more complex births, or just simply where they're outside the guidelines isn't always that complex. But tonight I wanted to shift the focus, and I wanted to share with you some insights from the PhD of what it is like for midwives actually delivering the care of out of guidelines normal physiological births. And the findings, remember, I had 45 midwives in the study, and the findings were extremely polarized, from very negative to very positive experiences within their workplaces. And that's something to be really clear about. It was their work environments that mediated how they felt and how they experienced delivering this care. And this is important because how the midwives' workplace environments are mediated in turn reinforces the ICM's concept that midwives need enabling work environments to practice to the fullest extent of their scope of practice. So we need to learn about these work environments so we can obviously, move on from those negative environments and look at the ones that are doing really well and see if we can, implement that across the board. So here's a recorded presentation for you all to watch, and I'm going to be around to take questions, so just stick them in the chat whenever you want, and we'll answer them at the end. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Dr. Claire Feeley, and I'm delighted to share the second phase of my PhD study, which explores the stories of distress versus fulfilment with narrative inquiry of midwives' experience of supporting women's alternative birthing choices. Big thanks to my professors Jill Thompson and Sue Down for all their support during my PhD. But just to unpack what I mean by alternative physiological birth choices, those are choices that go outside of maternity guidelines, where women are seeking less medical care or interventions, or when women decline recommended treatment or care. But that is really specifically for those seeking a normal birth. So this does preclude women and birthing people who are wanting more interventions, more medical care. Not that they're not important, but it wasn't the focus of my PhD. And we know that supporting women's choice matters for so many reasons, and has a long-term biopsychosocial impact if they don't feel supported in their choices. And that's all linked to issues around control, bodily autonomy, providing dignified and respectful care, which we know makes a difference between a positive and a negative birth experience. Even where women's birth desires don't go according to plan, even when emergencies arise, the international literature is very much telling us the mitigating factor between a stressful or frightening experience and one that would lead to really negative experience and PTSD is the care that they were given. Were they fully supported? Did they feel safe? Were they still central to the decision making around that emergency care? And we know that has a huge impact across the woman's life course. And all of this is connected to human rights. So although some practitioners are less comfortable with out of guidelines birth choices, particularly where they deem women to have risk factors that preclude them from perhaps having the home birth or birthing on the birth centre, we need to move beyond that, because of all of these things here in this slide are so important for women and their experiences and that long-term effect. So while in the UK we have got the best legislation in the world in terms of human rights during childbirth, we have got some of the best policy, we've got some of the best infrastructure in terms of, because we have the NHS, home births generally in birth centres, we've got that infrastructure between primary and secondary. Hello, my name is Dr. Claire Feeley and I'm delighted to share the second phase of my PhD study, which explores the stories of distress versus fulfillment, which is a narrative inquiry of midwives' experience of supporting women's alternative birthing choices. Big thanks to my professors, Jill Thompson and Sue Down, for all their support during my PhD. But just to unpack what I mean by alternative physiological birth choices, those are choices that go outside of maternity guidelines, where women are seeking less medical care or interventions, or when women decline recommended treatment or care. But that is really specifically for those seeking a normal birth. So this does preclude women and birthing people who are wanting more interventions, more medical care. Not that they're not important, but it wasn't the focus of my PhD. And we know that supporting women's choice matters for so many reasons, and it has a long-term biopsychosocial impact if they don't feel supported in their choices. And that's all linked to issues around control, bodily autonomy, providing dignified and respectful care, which we know makes a difference between a positive and a negative birth experience. Even where women's birth desires don't go according to plan, even when emergencies arise, the international literature is very much telling us the mitigating factor between a stressful or a frightening experience and one that would lead to really negative experience and PTSD is the care that they were given. Were they fully supported? Did they feel safe? Were they still central to the decision making around that emergency care? And we know that has a huge impact across the woman's life course. And all of this is connected to human rights. So although some practitioners are less comfortable with out of guidelines birth choices, particularly where they deem women to have risk factors that preclude them from perhaps having their home birth or birthing on the birth centre, we need to move beyond that, because of all of these things here in this slide are so important for women and their experiences and that long-term effect. So while in the UK we have got the best legislation in the world in terms of human rights during childbirth, we have got some of the best policy, we've got some of the best infrastructure in terms of, because we have the NHS, home births generally in birth centres, we've got that infrastructure between primary and secondary care, community care, and then hospital care. So we do have some really positive things within the UK. However, we cannot be divorced from this cultural web of context, where although all the policy documents, the legislation even, absolutely is underpinned by choice and bodily autonomy, however, there's issues around that being rhetorical versus the reality. So very often women may not feel that they are able to assert their agency and retain that bodily autonomy. And the reasons for this are extraordinarily complex, which is why I like to use the web analogy. We've got issues around the wider discourses of growing medicalisation, institutionalisation. So that's when you look at the hospital-based care, and when you look at that from a population level, we do a bloody good job. However, because of the scale, because of the size, the busyness, it lends itself to routines, and these routines can get entrenched. And then that is also in turn something that is coined as routine-based care, as opposed to individuals getting their needs met. Particularly maternity care, particularly in that birthing sphere, birth does not perform under these strict time measures, and it does not conform to routines. However, that's where the issues come in, when you've got this clash of institutionalisation. And then, of course, we can't get away from the risk and litigious society, you know, the broader society we're in, but it's particularly acute within maternity care. And issues around governance also linked to institutionalisation, and I'd have to come back to that another time. The other thing to bear in mind in terms of thinking about context is that midwives are not a homogenous group, unsurprising to the audience here. However, although the title of a midwife is legally protected, it's internationally defined, and there are key aspects which make up a midwifery philosophy of care. That's not to say that all midwives align with that philosophy of care. So some midwives are much more comfortable within this institutionalized, medicalized framework of delivering childbearing care, and then others do not. Others really wish to what we call have a woman-centered approach, where that individual, their needs are absolutely paramount and supersede the larger scale institution. And obviously things like that are very dependent on midwives' personal experiences, professional experiences. Perhaps they've had a bad outcome. They might have had their own experiences of birthing care themselves when they've had their own babies, etc. So it's just really important to think about the complexities around the issues. So for my study, I interviewed and gathered narratives, self-written narratives from 45 NHS midwives from across the UK. Very important to capture those from different practice settings, like I mentioned earlier, community, the hospital, different places within the hospital, those who deliver home birth care, those who work in birth centres. And it was very important, and I'm very pleased that different midwives with different levels of experience, so from very junior, just newly qualified, which is the band 5 you can see here, to very senior, perhaps consultant midwives, very experienced. But what I sought out to do was actually ask the data 3 research questions. So you can see it's a narrative inquiry, but it's a pluralist analysis. So previous work which has been published was really looking at the nuts and bolts of that midwifery care. How did they do it? Today, I'm going to focus on their experiences of facilitating, bearing in mind that cultural web of context I've already described, that I suppose you're starting to get the idea that this might not be straightforward, even though we've got this amazing legislation, infrastructure and policy. And then leading on from today is another analysis, and that is looking and using what we know from these first 2 levels of analysis. And then I put that into a theoretical model to explain the social, cultural, political influences on the midwives' care. So in this part of the study, where it's really around meaning making, sense making for the midwives, after they told me very detailed, in depth and a wide variety of stories, professional stories of where they've been involved with looking after women out of guidelines. These range from just what we'd call a nudge outside of guidelines, you know, nothing spectacularly complicated, to really complex cases where women had multiple medical and obstetric needs, and perhaps they were seeking a home birth. But moving away from those specific stories or examples of the practice, the reason why I wanted so many people in the study was to look beyond the specifics and get to a bigger sense, a broader sense. So for these midwives, they self-defined as facilitative of women's choices. So that means that this is part of their normal practice. And you can see from these storyline themes here that we've got quite a polarization, stories of distress all the way down to stories of fulfillment. The most important, I suppose, take-home message within just 15 minutes to talk about this today is that the work environment was the mediating factor between these really distressing stories up at the top here and these stories of fulfillment. Issues around lack of support within their immediate work environment, so their immediate teams, place of work, and then the broader hospital, trust, guidelines, etc. Top down, bottom up, that was either super unsupportive or incredibly supportive. So we've got issues around whether midwives obstructed in delivering the care that they wanted to, in supporting and fulfilling their duties. Midwives we are regulated, we have to assign, we are registered. So there are certain things within our professional code of conduct we have to do, but sometimes that there's a tension between that and what our employers want us to do. So we've got issues here around whether midwives obstructed to deliver the care, or were they enabled? And this also very much married to their philosophy. Did their philosophy, the personal philosophy of these midwives, perhaps there was either an alignment with their wider teams and the institutional norms, or a radical misalignment, as you will see just shortly. So here we've got Meg. Her feelings have been torn, permeated across her interview through several examples, all of which related to concern that the relevant hospital guidelines were not based on good evidence and were detrimental to women's experience of care. So she was torn between her personal knowledge, her professional knowledge, and her employer expectations of working within the guidelines. So she expressed deep moral conflict. And you can see here, and there's one example, but basically I've been in a theatre with this woman, holding her hands as things were happening, and I just thought, this shouldn't be happening. And I feel that was a terrible moral dilemma. It feels deeply immoral to me. Yes, I feel it's a real dilemma. And then she moves on, and you can see in this next quote, what I feel to be right is conflicted to what my employer is expecting of me. That's difficult to live with. Yeah, I sometimes feel I've acted immoral. I feel powerless. I don't feel agency within the situation. And unique, maybe not unique to Meg, but it was very stark that she internalized that. She blamed herself rather than expressing anger towards the institution, which some of the other counts were much more vocally angry with the position they felt they were put in. So just to give you a little brief insight to what I meant by battle, here's a little quote that was kindly recorded from a colleague of mine.
I often feel like I'm labelled as a troublemaker midwife when I walk on the labour ward, that people think I'm brainwashing my women to decline induction or decline prophylactic antibiotics, etc., when in reality I'm just supporting them to make their own informed decisions. Once women realise that they have a choice and a voice, they feel more confident to do what feels right for them in their own unique circumstances.
And in the more extreme reproach and recrimination, they had midwives who were referred to the NMC, their statutory body. They were under investigation. And you can hear the pain in this next and the conflicts around the situation, as this midwife felt very much pressured by her seniors that she didn't coerce the woman strongly enough in having a vaginal examination.
My colleagues and supervisor of midwives have advised me that I should be more forceful or get another midwife into the room to help me convince the woman. But I strongly believe that consent's a choice. You know, if you thoroughly explain what you want to do and the rationale behind why you want to do it, if the woman does not want you to do whatever it is you're wanting to do, you don't do it. Otherwise, it's not consent, is it? And that could be classed as abuse.
So we've got this, what feels like very straightforward legislation in this country to protect women from coercive practices, abusive practices, because putting your hands on a woman where she's not consented is against the law. But you can see these conflicts as they intermix and relate to that cultural web, complex web, contextual web for the midwives. And you can perhaps hear and indicate the fear from the senior midwives by not doing what's expected of them from an employee perspective. However, in deep contrast were the midwives with stories of fulfillment, and these related to a sense of the ordinary, where the midwifery practices were marked by a lack of conflict, animosity, or distress. So rather a feeling, rather a feeling of being able to get on with the job, they were able to facilitate women's and birthing people's choices. And this was generally associated with midwives being situated within supportive working environments where women's alternative choices were mostly accepted. And so for some of them, the narratives related to a sense of camaraderie, either between themselves or the women, or themselves and the team. And then a few participants expressed a feeling of the sublime to accounts of love, awe, tenderness, attunement, and reverence. So the key message, midwives had reported extremely polarized experiences, and this was mediated by social and cultural contexts. Their ability to practice woman or person-centered care was strongly influenced by their working environments. Organizational cultures, so you've got blame and punitive versus supportive and enabling, were the key mediating factors between positive and negative experiences. For those experiencing negativity, it raises concerns about sustainability, where you've got this great distress, stress, and impact on mental and physical health. How can those midwives continue to serve the women in the way they have been, whilst continuing in an unsupported environment? Positive organisational cultures were also identified. So where midwives and women's autonomy were respected and supported, it does show the feasibility and achievability of delivering this sort of care within large-scale organisations. I'm really mindful that's a whistle-stop tour through very rich findings. I'm hoping that you will come find me at my website if you want to learn more. Thank you so much.
Okay, Claire, did you want to add anything to your presentation at that point?
Sorry, I wasn't sure you're waiting for me. Yeah, as I pre-recorded that for a conference a while back, I realised watching it back there, I didn't press play on one of the most beautiful quotes. So if I can find that separately, I'll play it at the end. I see that I must have been running out of time for it and skip to the next slide. But no, hopefully that's a snapshot. And this is the paper that was published. So if you want more insights and more of a really either heartbreaking or beautiful quotes, it's the one called Stories of Distress versus Fulfillment. And you can message me for a PDF if you can't access it, but I would have thought a fair amount of the audience have access to Athens, and you can get that from the Women and Birth Journal. But you know, get in touch with me, it's absolutely fine. But it really is worth taking the time to read just the extraordinary polarization. But how great we've got midwives working in amazing environments, and they could just get on with it and then have these amazing, beautiful, really highly connective, reciprocal experiences, which changed some of the midwives' lives forever because they had such beautiful connections with the people in their care. So I'll probably leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Claire. I mean, I've got a little spider graph I've sort of drawn out, because I think what hit me the most with your presentation was the kind of it was the polarized bit of it. So you've got this group of midwives who are very feeling supported and so they can practice fully, and then you've got this group of midwives who don't feel as supported. And
watching their back.
Yeah, you know, who are operating and succeeding in spite of. Hopefully they're succeeding in spite of. So thank you so much. Now, audience, please, if you'd like to ask Claire any questions, as usual, we'll have a little bit at the end where you can address your questions. They'll come through to me and I shall field them to Anna and Claire. But I just want to say a big thank you to Claire for sharing that research. I know it was a huge piece of work and there's lots of material, and if you go to the resources sheet that we always provide, you'll see that Claire's website is there and you can get access to all these materials and a little bit of reading after this. That's your homework for you. Okay, without further ado, we'll move on to Anna. Now, Anna Madeley is a registered midwife. She's full-time doctoral researcher at the Open University, and she is exploring the experience of women who make non-normative choices in pregnancy. She's also, like Claire's, worked in a variety of maternity settings, including she's established and run a home birth team before moving into midwifery education as a senior lecturer. She combines lecturing with specialist teaching and research interests in all aspects of contemporary midwifery practice, and there are many of those, that's for sure, and physiologically informed care, research, individualized and complex care planning, and her passion for home birth, which we've mentioned already. So Anna, I think I'll just say the screen is yours because I don't want to miss a moment of what you're going to share with us.
Okay,
welcome.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to start sharing some of the findings of the work that I'm currently completing. I'm not anywhere near where Claire is at the moment in terms of her research. However, I'm kind of halfway through my data collection for my empirical work. What I'd like to share with you today, though, are the findings of some of the brief findings of my systematic review that I completed as part of my PhD, which explored obviously the attitudes, views, etc., and the challenges associated with making non-normative choices and what that looks like within kind of current maternity care. So I'm just going to share my slides now. Okay. Can you see that? I just want to make sure I can see you can see that. Marvelous. So I want to share with you initially just some thoughts around choices in maternity care, and Claire's covered off quite a lot of what I would have got into in terms of autonomy and choice and where we sit in terms of the choice agenda within the UK. Currently, we have excellent frameworks within the UK, and despite searching for a global perspective, it's actually quite challenging to find anywhere else within internationally that have the frameworks that have been established within the UK for providing true choice in maternity care. And as we know, that goes back to the early 90s. What we as midwives and clinicians also know is that the reality of providing choice isn't actually aligned with the rhetoric around choices that in particular might challenge clinicians who are working with women and birthing people who might not want to follow guideline or want to make choices that we would necessarily recommend. My interest around this came predominantly from my experiences in supporting women to have home births outside of guidance. And it was very clear to me that there is an emerging evidence base that supports ongoing development around how midwives support those choices, and in particular the kind of bigger choices, and focusing on predominantly, if you look at the research in the UK rather than globally, those focuses are around free birth, water birth after caesarean, things like declining induction, high risk home birth, and a large body of evidence around maternal request caesarean section. But what was really evident is there was no real exploration of how women experience making more discrete choices. So those choices that we don't tend to have the larger discussions around. So it might be the declining of a vaginal examination, declining of screening. Whilst we have a body of evidence that explores decision making for the cohort of women that are having babies, what we don't necessarily understand are the social processes and the decision making processes around how and why women make decisions to decline care or to not follow recommended guidance. What we do know is that these choices sit not just within a legal, ethical and clinical framework, but choices are made within a social framework as well. So expectations that although we are offering interventions as choices, such as screening, routinely undertaken, taking a blood pressure, auscultation, the social expectation is that people will accept that. When they decline, do we really understand what's going on and why that's happening? Within the UK, the focus, as I say, has been on these more discrete elements of care, and they tend to be focused around birth, mode of birth, place of birth, and within a risk framework. So what I'm interested in is looking at it more holistically, looking along the entire maternity continuum, and seeing where the gaps are. And I use this, or have used this picture of a jigsaw, because actually there are huge gaps. There are elements of experience that we don't really understand, and in order to be able to provide an equitable framework for care, particularly when those choices don't necessarily align with what we would recommend, then we need to truly understand what's going on, which is what my PhD is about. So the first piece of work that I did, which is hopefully due to be published soon, so this is hot off the press, is my meta-ethnography. So in order to define what I mean by non-normative choice, I came up with this really snappy definition. I'm aware it's insanely wordy, but it was quite difficult to pin this down. So the difference between where Claire's work is situated around physiological birth and the pursuit of kind of those protecting that physiological birth, is that mine includes interventions that might be requested as well. So here's my review definition. It's a fully autonomous decision made by any woman or birthing person at any point at the childbirth continuum to wholly or in part decline, refuse or request an alternative to routinely offered, clinically indicated or guideline policy mandated recommended care, pathway, physical examination, screening or intervention, place or mode of birth for any reason, and which where uptake or compliance is considered socially accepted norm, or where the choice might be deemed unusual, alternative and unconventional. So I have to do that in two breaths because I can't do that all in one. So my first piece of work was around where has this been explored? So I chose a meta-ethnographic methodology in order to not just thematically analyse, but look at the processes that are going on, and they'll be able to support theory generation, which will hopefully then go on to support my empirical research, which is a grounded theory study. So I undertook a search just over a year ago now, and through the search identified 33 studies that fit the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which were broadly research that had been undertaken post-change in childbirth around 1993 within healthcare systems that were similar to the UK, in order that we could look at similarities, etc. The studies came from the studies that went through that process came from the UK, Australia, Iceland, Sweden, Holland, Norway, Netherlands and Ireland. And as is always the way with these reviews, there has been research published post review, which I'll touch on at the end. Those 33 studies broadly dealt with caesarean section at maternal request in the absence of a clinical indication, birth arrangements against medical advice, declining screening or elements of screening, including declining information around that, declining recommended care or treatment, registered caregivers and interventions, and registered caregivers obviously included the free birth and predominantly in Australia as well, around registrants providing care, so non-registered caregivers, and then place of birth against medical advice. So those of you that are familiar with the meta-ethnographic method, there are 7 canonical stages, which I could talk for about 4 hours on at the moment, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. But essentially it's around the analysis and synthesis of the data within those papers to be able to look at reciprocally or refutationally drawing out concepts. So of those 33 studies, I think I ended up with somewhere in the region of 400 codes, which through the process of going back, working through cyclical comparison, I ended up with 3 reciprocal conceptual categories and 1 refutational conceptual category. So the reciprocal categories are looking at, I'll present them. I think that's probably easier rather than me playing on. Okay, so the three were, the first one was influences and motivations for a non-normative choice. So the studies overall there was a huge amount of kind of core reciprocity, so similarity in terms of the experiences of women making such choices, regardless of what those choices were. Their experiences were incredibly similar, particularly in relation to influences and motivations. So some of this will not be a surprise. So that obviously the women's philosophy, values and beliefs around pregnancy and childbirth heavily influenced how those choices were made, and not just in relation to and this is where I find it quite interesting, to what we assume to be a pushback against the system, but in particular women and birthing people who might request intervention. So in particular things like wanting to birth in a hospital and have as much intervention as possible because their familial experiences and what they'd seen in their family was not a positive experience. So that influenced their decisions, and their philosophy around childbirth. Again, I think we tend to assume with regards to philosophy that women making non-normative choices do so in order to protect birth as almost a sacred passage, a rite of passage. But what I found within these papers was that there were cohorts of women whose philosophy was that they didn't hold pregnancy and childbirth in any particular type of regard, and that influenced an increase in request for intervention. There were obviously social cultural influences, so particularly in relation to screening, whether or not the uptake of screening and declining screening was held with suspicion, which I found again particularly interesting in one or two papers where they felt that screening had a particular gender that was hidden, and therefore they couldn't accept it, couldn't accept screening, or felt they had to decline it because they didn't subscribe to those kind of social cultural agendas, which was I find it all quite interesting. So risk interpretation and safety was one that came up time and time again, which again will not come as any particular type of surprise, but in relation to how women looked at the risks they were being presented and evaluated them in accordance with their own philosophy, values and beliefs, and then that helped with formulating their decisions to say no, or to say actually I'd like as much as I can. Ambivalence came up again and again across all of the papers, really, regardless of whether it was mode of birth, regardless of whether it was screening that was being declined, induction of labour, etc. Because and again that fitted in with the philosophy, values and beliefs, and whether or not they held pregnancy to be a particular rite of passage, or whether actually for them having a healthy baby then was all that mattered, so they would surrender themselves to the medical community. The one that absolutely did not come as a surprise was that a particular influence and motivation was whether or not they had had previous experiences that would potentially re-traumatize them. So they were making choices that were preventative in order to avoid that. And fear of the institution, fear of clinicians, but not just in relation to childbirth and childbearing, but also in relation to previous experiences. There was one study where somebody just wanted to completely avoid any healthcare professional because of their experience as a child and receiving care as a child. I use the analogy of the boiling pot to describe what happened when women came together with healthcare professionals within the institution, and how they described how this influenced their decision making. And this ties in and reflects what Claire was saying about systems that are supportive or not. So they talk of an inflexible, fearful, risk-averse system, and that was reflected, again, regardless of the nature of the choices they were making, the mode of birth, the screening, whether or not it was induction of labour, etc., and questioning the motivations of the advice that they were being given. For whose benefit was it? Was it because they truly had these risks that they wanted to avoid, or was it to avoid litigation? Was it to avoid any abnormal outcome that would be a problem for the healthcare providers rather than the woman? Working outside policies, procedures and guidelines, finding that they are rigid and that healthcare professionals were unlikely to move outside of them and having to push back against them. And then the institutional manifestations of care, and Beck Jenkinson in Australia talks of this, and it's reflected in a number of other studies, that there's almost a stepping up of behaviour as those decisions are made, which can start with really subtle undermining of bodily autonomy, all the way up to violence and assault, and many women would reflect on the fact that that was the institution, manifestation of that institutional fear of a poor outcome, and being pushed to comply, which is really sad, really, really sad. The last reciprocal translation came about was knowledge as empowerment, and I found this not surprising, but it was interesting in terms of where information was sought, and particularly in the free birth literature. The information was sought completely outside of the healthcare spectrum, and actually where information was provided, again, it was seen with a degree of suspicion, and healthcare providers were the last people that women were engaging with in order to get a balanced view. And then how women operationalized that knowledge, how did they make those choices, and there was some quite forgotten the word, there's some quite impressive is the wrong word, but being able to challenge those risk recommendations or challenge the recommendations of healthcare professionals, but then having to use sort of, not underhand, that's the wrong word, but having to use sort of ways to manipulate the system themselves in order to achieve what they needed to, and that broke down trust with healthcare professionals. It's not all bad though, I have to say, because the reputational construct at the end that and the translation reflects Claire's and positions Claire's research. This is where that sits, because they do speak across a number of the studies of facilitative healthcare providers and finding a middle ground and being heard and being listened to and not being written off as just making wild decisions that can be that are dangerous for them or their baby, and recognizing that regardless of whether or not their choices could result in mortality or morbidity for them or the fetus, the baby, that they were supportive of that because they worked within that human rights and kind of relational framework, so they were able to come to a middle ground. So what are the implications then for practice and future research? Well, what came across really strongly was that there was a lack of representation overall in the data from any diverse backgrounds other than those that were particularly targeted within one or two of the 33 studies. So representation of Black, Asian, diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds, but also within the LGBTQ community. that data either hasn't been collected or hasn't been part of that research. And given the research that came out during COVID, Marie Greenfield's work that has demonstrated that free birth seemed to be an increasing phenomenon within the LGBTQ community, I'm interested to find out whether or not diversity actually plays a part in decision making, and that's part of my ongoing research too. There's wider scope for understanding experiences of non-normative choices that are outside the larger subjects, so the high-risk home birth, the free birth, the maternal request cesarean section, the more discrete choices, the pushing induction back slightly. So whether or not we can understand whether there's commonality to be able to develop more appropriate care for women who make such choices. Recognising that the range of routinely presented choices are presented as choices, but actually socially expected to be accepted. So things like screening, in particular, scans as well. And then there remains a gap in relation to understanding holistic experiences around motivators, institutional, familial and personal reasons behind it. And that's where my empirical research is situated and ongoing at the moment, in order that we can create firm evidence base upon which to predicate equitable care pathways. And that's it. Thank you very much. I've popped a nod into my PhD supervisors just in case they've tuned in tonight, Sarah, Lindsay and Sally. And I just want to say thank you to all the women of birthing people who are currently contributing to my research. And if you want to get in touch, you can. My email address is there. I, like Sue, I'm slightly addicted to Twitter. It is my key procrastinating place, and you can follow the project as well on Twitter and on Insta. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Anna. And just to remind the audience that you will get all of these slides. So if you're worried about catching the email, Anna's email, you'll be able to get hold of that quite straightforwardly afterwards. So just be patient and you get it all through. We've got a few comments and a few questions. We've got a question from Deepa Santosh. Hi, Deepa. Hope you're well. And she's got a question for Claire. She's made it very easy for me to where it has to go. Absolutely brilliant presentation. I think they're both brilliant. How do you suggest a student midwife deals with this conflict, particularly when we learn and absorb both types of practice, both kinds of practice? That's a nice, easy question, Claire.
Well, Anna can help with this one as well. I mean, that's the $1 million question, Deepa. If I could answer that, I think I'd be rich. I think the advice that I sought when I was a student with exactly that dilemma, and it felt a bit flippant at times, but I think they were right, of you have to decide. You will work with loads of different people and you need to take the best bits from all of them. And there are some things that you will feel complicit but it's not your pin, and you have to remember that the midwife that you're working with, even if you fundamentally disagree, beyond, I'm talking about abuse and assault here, but if it's a disagreement, then sometimes as a student we don't fully understand those midwives or our mentors, supervisors' rationale. It may become clearer when we qualify and we have more experience, or it may not, and it may be one of those things you say, right, I am not going to do that. And I did have a couple of fabulous midwives, and one, I think she stood out to me because she actually practiced, she was very different, but she was so committed of, you have to own your practice. So she empowered me to own mine, even though it was really fundamentally different to hers. So that's an annoying woolly answer, I'm afraid, but it is woolly.
I don't think it's woolly. I think it says something to Deepa. So thank you for the question, Deepa. It also says something to us as midwives, because sometimes I think, especially when we're less experienced, you kind of make a decision, but you don't necessarily. Sometimes you don't know why you've made a decision, and sometimes you make the decision because that's the way you've always done it, or you know, that's the way the routine says. And sometimes if you're working with a student, and I think it's a good reminder for us as midwives, you need to talk it through with your student. And the student may be, and if it's obviously, if it's frantically busy, don't do this, but you could ask your midwife, what was your thinking through that? Can you just help me through it? Because we all need to learn how to make good decisions. So I mean, it's that was a really good question, Deepa. Thank you. Yeah. And a good answer, Claire. Not woolly at all, not at all. Now we've got Kashmira Kim Parek, and she says, it's more a comment, I think. Often I've found that women who choose to give birth outside of hospital guidelines are perceived by some midwives or obstetricians as having a mental health problem. Mm-hmm. This is the question I often get asked when I complete a birth plan for women. I think I didn't say a question, well, so.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say, and Anna will jump in on this one as well, we need to stop that stigma, because that is a slur on people with mental health problems.
Right.
You know, okay, I'm not going to go off on one, but by adopting the language of the human rights framework, by understanding Absolutely. Mental capacity, mm-hmm. you can advocate. And when you start dropping those words of mental capacity, mm-hmm. It really does do a fast track into colleagues' brains. It's not even conscious, but there will often be a moment for them to pause, step back and back down a little bit on such stigmatizing attitudes and beliefs. Anna, definitely, please take over on this one.
I would 100% agree with this, and I had a very similar conversation with some students on Monday, and particularly around mental capacity, and not to assume, we should always assume that people have capacity to make decisions, even and it's you know, legally bound. It is, even if we wouldn't make that decision, or that decision might lead to a poor outcome. We can't, and we should not coerce, and we shouldn't assume that there is a lack of mental capacity or mental health issue. I would go back to looking at NHS England's personalised care planning guidance, and that's really clear. I think it's really, really clear in terms of not just focusing on, is this a recommendation we've made, and if they say no, then actually we're not going to engage with them. We need to really explore the values, needs and preferences of these women, try to understand why they're making that decision, because that's how you build that relationship, and you could potentially find that middle ground, because they will just push back, and that does nobody any good at all. So I'm on a rant now. Thank you. That's a good question.
And it just undermines for the people in our care that do have mental health and needs. Then it's that slur, like that's a bad thing. And we've all of us are going to experience some sort of mental health challenge at some point. I mean, we've just been still in a pandemic.
Yeah.
But it's patronising, sexist and misogynistic and paternalistic to assume that mental health, if there's poor mental health, then that's a driver to making stupid, and it will be perceived as stupid decisions. So I will stop now.
A stupid decision if it doesn't agree with ours. I mean, I think there's some really good references as well that you've mentioned, including the NHS choices one, and also the audience may have remembered the Birthrights website, and that's a really good source of information. And reading it will help you think about, well, have I given the woman the proper information? Am I listening? Because I think sometimes if you're busy, you don't always listen to what the woman's saying, and it's very important. So Kashmira, that was a fantastic point to make. And then I have, this is a nice easy one. Thank you, Jenny Hall. And she's sending a question to both of you. She's had a discussion this week about safety. What's your definition of what you mean by safety in your studies? Okay. That's an easy one.
Of course. For me, it's holistic, and it has to be biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual, And the fact we are, increasingly narrow in our physical safety culture, which actually then creates this unfortunate perverse system of iatrogenic harm. So if it is physical safety that we're worried about, we need to be looking at it differently anyway. But without taking those holistic needs in to consideration, then that care isn't safe. If you've ignored the fact that for a woman to have a C-section or not to have an episiotomy, for example, is culturally, not safe care, then we're not doing it properly. And I don't know what Anna's got on that.
I agree, and I would suggest to ring fence physical safety as the kind of the be all and all in terms of ensuring a particular outcome is disingenuous. It's around the psychosocial safety. It's around, and I go back to what I'm saying about understanding women's needs, views, preferences. A really firm evidence base, isn't there, around if a woman feels heard, she feels listened to, and that her choices are supported. Down the road, she's going. That it affects the degree of trauma, if they have any trauma at all, and to ensure that woman remains at the centre of the care. One of the things that I'm focusing on at the moment is woman-centred versus fetus-centred care, and when does that change? So keeping her at the centre and ensuring that that will ensure safety. Sorry, it's a bit of a pants-alt.
I think someone, it might have been Rachel, the brilliant Rachel Reed. And if it's not Rachel, I'm sure she said it, and whoever has coined it. But who are we to think that us practitioners, healthcare professionals, have a greater vested interest in that child than the mother and family themselves? Now, I'm not going to go there on those very rare occasions where it is an intentional, harmful abusive environment, because they are rare in comparison to what we're seeing in everyday practice, of course. But I just wanted to acknowledge, of course, it does happen on occasion. But whoever said it, thank you. It might have actually been in one of the papers, Anna, because I'm sure I've used it in my metasynthesis as well. But it was just such a eye-opener. It might have been one of the independent midwife studies, actually. And it was just like, it articulated something that I felt that I hadn't managed to put into words. It's almost, it's fear-based, I know, but it can also be seen as arrogance. That you and it is misogynistic. You silly woman, we know best.
And challenging those behaviours as well, because we have all stood at a board on a labour ward, and it's been that woman in room X and she's refusing VEs, and challenging that behaviour, because that is clearly something that means so much to her, and for her psychological safety, we've got to protect that. That's our job as midwives, absolutely.
And going against the parapet for that woman is actually really difficult.
It is hard.
Especially if she comes into an actual hospital environment. It's much easier for her on a birth centre, a freestanding birth centre, I'll be specific here, or at home. It's much easier for her to, assert her agency. Hospital environment. So if she has come in with that birth plan, absolutely. And let's not just take things at face value. 1 in 3 women have had some sort of assault.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a brilliant point. And we have to take, and the idea that the women feel safer in their home and in a birth centre than in a hospital, it says something about what we do in those places.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Now I've got one more question, I think. So Janine McKnight, hi Janine, says, so if a personalised care requires us to ask women what matters to them rather than what's the matter with them, how can we ensure safety and choice?
I think you've answered it. You start with that question. You start with what's important to you, to that woman or birthing person in front of you. If you start from there, you're fulfilling the moral, ethical, and legal duty and the Montgomery ruling. What's important to you? Have you thought of what's your feelings about birth? What are you hoping for? How can I help? And then it's a two-way dialogue, actual conversation, not the guidelines say this is what we do here.
Someone, and I'll just add to that, and I've heard this, and I think, I want to say it's Tim Draycott that sent it, but I'm probably wrong. But asking the woman, what is your ideal outcome at the end of your pregnancy? When you look back, and actually one of my participants has said something very similar, when you're sat reflecting on your pregnancy and you're reflecting on your choices, what are you going to sit there and say, I wish I'd done this differently? And then or what is your ideal outcome? And for some women, they will not say a healthy baby at the end of it is my number one outcome. It might be that they want a fulfilling pregnancy and birthing experience, and we have to appreciate that. That's not wrong for them. That's important.
Fabulous. Do you know, I think our audience have asked some fantastic questions, so thank you so much. And I have to be very strict now because we've run over a teeny weeny bit. But I want to say huge thank you to Claire and Anna, who've been so generous with their time. They will come back, audience. They will come back because they've still got a lot to say. And obviously from the audience kind of participation, people are very interested in this whole area. And it's not an easy one at all. And I think they've both illustrated how tricky it can be for the service itself, but also for individual midwives. And at the end of it, who are most important people are our women and our families and the people we serve. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll look forward to having you again. Now, just remind the audience, the resources will be available on the website and on Facebook on Friday. Don't forget to book for the following. Now, next week, we've got on our maternity and midwifery hour, we have got Dr. Paul Clark and Dr. Paul Corley talking about, I love this one, delivery room cuddles for preterm babies. And I think that's going to be slightly different because, you know, preterm babies, but we as midwives do look after women and families with preterm babies, and we need to know more about it. You only have to look at the NMC proficiencies now. We need to have much more knowledge about babies and fetuses and babies and everything. So we need to get that on. And then do book for London Maternity and Midwifery Festival on the 1st of March in London. And in the meantime, stay safe, look after yourselves. And I'll reiterate that, look after yourselves and your loved ones, give them an extra hug. And if you haven't had your vaccinations, do think about it. You'll feel good. I think you will anyway. That's my bias coming out, so apologies for that. And we'll see you next week for the cuddles. And thank you again for our lovely speakers, and thank you to the team for looking after everything this evening as well. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the benefits, I think, of a platform like this is that if you are busy clinically, or if you can't watch or listen or engage real time, you can do this at other times. So that is fabulous for such a time as this. So delighted to be with you all, albeit virtually on the screen. My name is Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent. I'm the Chief Midwifery Officer for the NHS in England.
So this is what's called a hybrid event. There are people in the room, there are people watching in groups around the country, and there are people still watching in their pajamas at home. Good morning, Sue, how are you?
Good morning, I'm fine, Neil, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here.
My argument is that the solution is health optimization. Prevention is far better than cure.
And I think there is a real risk that services that are lost or reduced during the time of COVID are not restored.
And I hope that you can take valuable insights from today. And if you're listening tonight, or if you're listening next week or next month, take valuable insights from the speakers from today and share the word, share the positive messages with your colleagues, because in these dark times, in these challenging times, everybody needs a green shoot and a pearl of wisdom. Thank you very much, and we are in this together. We stand united together.